That empathic understanding then is what builds society. That's the glue of human culture. And although we think that with Facebook, we can have 3,000 friends or whatever, that is not the same as developing an empathic understanding of an individual. In fact, the internet, as we all know, is a place for extraordinary bullying and general difficulties for many young kids. They feel, my God, I wrote that text to my friend 5 minutes ago. Why haven't they called back? Do they not like me anymore?
Hello and welcome to Digital Mindfulness. I'm your host, Lawrence Ampofo. Today we're here with Dr. Peter Whybrow. As the director of the Semel Institute of Neuroscience and Human Behavior at UCLA, Peter has been working for decades at the cutting edge of neuroscience and psychiatry. In particular, Peter focuses his work on the effects of technologies on our brains and what we can do about it. You should listen to this episode if you want to understand how digital technologies impact our brains, why people born in the digital age suffer from greater anxiety, and how you can develop a well-tuned brain. But first of all, welcome to the show. For over 3 years now, we've brought to you the best teachers, thought leaders, and industry experts to teach you how to be your best self in a digitally distracted world. If you're new to our show, then the best place to find out much more about us is to visit digitalmindfulness.net/start, which has a collection of some required listening podcasts where we discuss everything from becoming more focused to habit building, cyberbullying, and much, much more. Okay, enjoy the show with Dr. Peter Whybrow. So, Peter Whybrow, thank you so much for being a part of Digital Mindfulness today. I'm really thrilled that you could make it onto the show. So welcome.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate being here. I like your podcasts.
So, Peter, I wonder if you'd share a little bit about your history and particularly how you came to be working in neuroscience and psychiatry, and also how that led you over to thinking about the effects of technology on our brains.
Well, I grew up in England, as you probably can hear, and I came to America as a migrant sometime in the 70s, and I'm an academic. I was trained in medicine and physiology and things in England at University College in London, University College Hospital Medical School there, and I studied endocrinology for a while, and then I became a psychiatrist, to make it very quick, because I was interested in thyroid hormones and how they influence the brain, and particularly how they modulate mood and emotion, which they do. So that's been my sort of academic research side of things. And when I first came to the U.S. in the 70s, I fell into a situation at Dartmouth College where I suddenly became an administrator. I was chairman of the Department of Psychiatry there and then became dean of the medical school. So suddenly I was sort of up to my ears in managing institutions, but I kept my science going, and I worked then at the University of Pennsylvania because I didn't much like being a dean. And then I migrated again to the West Coast, where for the last 15 plus years, I've been director of a very large institute and hospital which focuses upon neuroscience and human behavior. It's called the Semel Institute now, though 60 years ago, when it was invented by the Californian legislature, it was called the Neuropsychiatric Institute. So the thing that fascinates me about this job is that I get to do all the things that I like, and I work with a lot of smart people, and at the same time, I get to use my neuroscience in trying to understand various cultural subjects. One of the things that I've written various books, and they started by really with my expertise in endocrinology and neuroscience, but then I moved to being interested in emotion. I wrote a book for the general public called A Mood Apart, which was very popular. And then my agent at the time, when this was back in the late 90s, said, there's something really peculiar about America, the way everybody rushes around as if their heads have been cut off. And don't you think this is a manic society? So that led to a book called American Mania, When More Is Not Enough, which won a few prizes. And I became increasingly interested in American culture and how you can explain some of the strangeness of America, because it is a rather idiosyncratic country. Everybody who lives here thinks that the rest of the world is like America, whereas in fact everybody who visits it knows immediately that it's absolutely not like the rest of the world. And so my last two books have been focused upon the elements of American culture that I think may be derived from the natural proclivity of migrants. Migrants are different from most other people. They're much more optimistic. They're much more energetic. They tend to be the folks who decide that life is not good enough where they are, and they move usually thousands of miles and start a new family, but they do so much as individuals. While they develop a nuclear family in the new place, they very often leave their original nuclear family. Just as in a statistic, for example, in England or in Britain, most people, about 60% of people die within 6 miles of where they were born. In America, most people, if you go to, when I give lectures, for example, I ask, how many of you are living 1,000 miles from where you were born? And very often 50% of the audience will put up a hand. So the migrant population is very different from the general population, and that's, of course, become increasingly so in recent years as technology of flying and boats and that sort of thing has made migration around the world particularly much easier than it was. And in addition to that, although we think that migration is always driven by economy, or at least that's the sort of general sense, it isn't really. It's driven by, I think, this temperament of the migrant, which is very individualistic, very energetic, focused upon very often materialism, especially in America. And so this shapes the culture. And so the book, American Mania, When More Is Not Enough, speaks to why it is that the American economy is constantly trying to grow, and yet, here we are. America's, I think, 340 million people, which is about 4% of the population of the world, but is consuming something like 25% of the world's resources. So traded resources. So you end up with this interesting anachronism where you find that America's norm is impossible if you think about it on a global level, and that has all sorts of implications for the environment and so on and so forth. So the second book, which is called The Well-Tuned Brain, was an attempt to take what we know, what I've just been describing in very cryptic terms, and think about what would be a way in which we could by using what we now know about neuroscience and human behavior, how could we better construct something that would enable us to live a more balanced and life that would be perhaps sustainable. And to do that, in this last book, I go back to the 18th century, to when the Enlightenment theories drove the concept that built the fundamental constitution of America, which is very individualistic, as you know, but it's based upon concepts of the European Enlightenment and the way in which Jefferson and others here wrote that stuff up. They were drawing upon people such as Locke and Hume and Smith, particularly Adam Smith. And if you look at the way in which America has evolved, it is around those concepts. But if you look more carefully, you realize that actually Adam Smith didn't say that individualism and markets were the solution. He basically said that freeing individuals so they could be entrepreneurial was very important, but the common good was essential, what we now call empathic understanding. He wrote 2 books, as you know, one of which is called The Moral Sentiments, and the other was The Wealth of Nations. But if you put those 2 books together, you have a fairly complete understanding of what would build a balanced society. And I think we've gone off the boat because we've sort of forgotten the social aspects, and we've tied our boat to the star of individualism. I'm talking now particularly about the US, which works, but it also has downsides, considerable downsides. And so coming to what you're interested in and your work has been focused upon, the digital revolution has tended to maximize that individualism, because now we can connect with individuals through technology in a way that we've never been able to do before. And my basic thesis then in the last book is that what you do with that access is you create a short circuit, if you will. You hijack, as we were talking about before, the very ancient brain, which is very individualistic and tied very much to survival and what happens now, and you short-circuit the planning, thoughtful, deliberative understanding of human attachment, the way in which we learn to trust each other, and so on and so forth. That stuff tends to be diminished, which has major implications for social organization and the way in which we probably could survive on this planet. So that's a rather long summary of some of my ideas. Yeah.
So, Peter, in your book, The Well-Tuned Brain, one of the things that you talk about at length is a whole idea that the way that we use digital technologies hijacks our brain, and as you mentioned earlier, leads us to be slightly less empathic and more individualistic. But I'm really wondering what led you to write this book and come up with these ideas. Was this lack of empathy? Was this something that you experienced yourself?
Well, I think it's happening very precisely here in the U.S. I mean, you can take various statistics, but for example, people in my generation, I was born around the Second World War time, have much less anxiety, believe it or not, than people of my daughter's generation, born in the 60s and 70s, and the generation that was born after that, the generations that were born after that, have even greater anxiety. And just last night I was at a meeting of some persons who help support the Institute here, who are persons who've donated and provided endowments for the Institute's work, about childhood anxiety, which is rampant. I mean, it's and when you are young and you lose that natural developmental evolution of learning to trust in the paradigm of parenting the child, and then from there being able to experiment within that opportunity of trust to create something of yourself, and we call that character eventually. And at the same time, of course, you begin to learn, because the culture provides with the opportunity for objective education. It ends up ideally with a balance between the emotional drive of individualism, which we were talking about before, which I was talking about before, and the social construct of recognizing that other people are also individuals, and if you can put yourself in their shoes, the empathic stuff, which Smith wrote so eloquently about in the moral sentiments, then you end up with a complete human being that can follow a logical argument, distill it through their own emotional predisposition, their sense of history within their own experience, which is what we call intuition, and come up with something which is pretty logical and straightforward and has room for other people to disagree with them. That process is the development of the human brain, and we're very clever creatures if we do that. If you look at the evolution of the human brain, there's a part of it which is very, very ancient, and then there's which is what we might call the engine, and that's what drives you getting up in the morning, etc. But there's also an intellectual part, which is the new brain, which is the frontal cortex predominantly, and that is quite young. I mean, Homo sapiens in our present form are really quite young creatures. We're only probably 300,000 years old. Of course, we come from a long line of primates, but that particular reflection, that Homo sapien, in other words, creature of wisdom, knowledge, is very much tied to the new brain, and it can be eclipsed by the old brain if the old brain is given enough, if the reins are taken off the old brain. So if you build a culture like we've built now, for example, where you have a digital world where you can get stimulation immediately, and you give a child an iPad at the age of 18 months, because they're fascinated, their old brain is tied very much to changing light, to any change. Most people, if a loud noise occurred right now in your studio, you would pay attention to that. You wouldn't be paying attention to me, because that's something novel and something intrusive. And the old brain is tied to that because it's a survival mechanism. And so if you give a child something that preoccupies them, their attention span grows shorter and shorter. And it's already short when you start, of course, because the task of childhood is really to create an awareness of the world beyond oneself, and actually to develop such old-fashioned things as patience and reflection and all the things that the frontal lobes do. And then that's where you get the balance. But if you don't do that, because you create an environment where a child doesn't have the opportunity to do that, you don't sit them out in the backyard with a saucepan and a wooden spoon where they can dig and find worms and bang on it and just generally experiment. If you give them a tool, which of course those things are, but a tool that constantly engages them, such as a brightly shiny thing that you can tap on and it will do other things for you, you actually change the way in which their brains develop. And so I think you had somebody on your show who was talking about contemplative, I think that was the word, contemplative digitization or something like that. But that's all well and good, but you're not going to get to the contemplative part if you start a young child on something which is going to reduce their attention span. So at the age of 7 or 8, you then put them in an English class, and they're trying to learn English grammar, and they can't possibly concentrate that long. So we've created for ourselves a fascinating dilemma, I think, where our technology is truly engaging and interesting, but it's also depriving us, in my opinion, with the reflective, contemplative opportunities to engage that technology in a way that maximizes our benefits. At the moment, of course, it's harnessed by the merchant, because the merchant knows very well that if you can keep that old brain interested, you'll buy the damn thing. I mean, why do you think people line up outside the iPhone establishment when the old one works perfectly well, but there's a new one coming out that has a slightly different plug in it, so you have to buy a new plug, and after you've bought your iPhone. I mean, I'm being somewhat cynical, but the fact is that our materialism, which drives our economy, and then you come back to Adam Smith and so on, because we've built an economy that just continues to expand, and so this whole thing is it's so interwoven that it's very difficult to shift human culture back into a mode where some sort of contemplation can be achieved. I mean, why, for example, do you have an interest in these things, even though you're a digital engineer? I don't know. It must be something to do with the way you were brought up, probably, because maybe you didn't have an iPad stuck in front of your nose at the age of 2. I don't know what did happen, but if you're following me, we've built a culture which is fascinating to the old brain, but not necessarily ideal for the development of balanced human beings. So the title of the book, The Well-Tuned Brain, is taken from the idea that the clavier, which was the sort of the first piano, was constantly going out of tune, and J.S. Bach wrote something called the Well-Tempered Clavier, and this was a student notebook in which people had to do these exercises and also taught how to tune the brain. So it's a metaphor. The title of the book is a metaphor that we have to learn how to tune our brains, and you learn that by understanding who you are. That's the first part of the book. Who do you think you are? And the second part of the book is, that goes through things like concentration and what is intuition? How does the brain work? But it also ties into political economy and tries to point out that if you understand the brain, you can see why it is that we have all these strange sort of economic turmoils and keep on going into bubbles and then trying to get our way out of them, etc., etc. The second part of the book tries to say, if we were to really take seriously what we know about the way the brain works now, we would not be creating, we would be more mindful, let me put it that way, of a society, of what society is doing, and build enough spaces, enough breathing spaces into it that you wouldn't be forcing children into having ADHD at the age of 7.
I think this is really fantastic, Peter, and I'd like to touch back on something that you mentioned earlier about how our society now is more anxious than when you were growing up, and I wonder if you can just talk a little bit more about that and just explain why that is. Is it exclusively the fault of digitization, would you say, that we have a culture now that is basically an on-demand culture? We expect everything right now, or are there other factors involved?
No, I think that is part of the very important part of the equation, actually. That I'm old enough to remember that if you wanted to study something, you had to go to the library, and you took 2x5 cards with you, and you wrote down lots of notes, and then you shuffled them so that you could understand the notes, etc., etc. Now you just pick up your smartphone, go to Wikipedia, and hope that the information you get is objective. Yes, you don't have to go through that process of analysis for yourself. So there is, and that was beginning when I first started doing statistics. You didn't have computers as much as you had handheld devices that you had to pull the lever, and you had to know a whole bunch of equations in order to analyze the statistics. Nobody knows anything about the equations anymore. You just throw them into a machine, and it'll give you the analysis based upon the data you put in there, and you tell them you'd like to compare various variables with various, and that will do it for you. So it's almost as if you have shortcuts, which are very, very valuable and have enabled us to have an enormously fascinating society, are not as useful as they might be for the individual who is trying to develop their own capacities for study and learning. So it is in part that everything is available instantaneously. You don't really learn as much, and you don't exercise your brain in the same way as we don't exercise our bodies. It's not irrelevant that 60% of the American population are overweight, and 30% of them are actually medically obese. Yes, and interestingly enough, that turns out to be the case. The fattest people in the world are English speaking. Believe it or not, that's another aside. So, if you don't have to open the garage door or get out of off the settee to turn the television on, slowly you forget how to do those things. And all you have to do is to press your smartphone to figure out whether Charles Darwin was a local pop singer or whether he actually developed the theory of human evolution. You don't get the nuance and the details which enable the human brain to become as clever as it is capable of. Now, a lot of people would disagree with me, and they'd say, well, technology is just the secret to the future. Eventually, we're going to fuse our brains with technology and we'll all be one happy family. I don't believe that. I think that the way in which human beings develop now is very similar to the way they developed a couple of 100,000 years ago. It's by experience, and there's a lot more around, but I think that the idea that somehow we are above our environment and we don't have to worry about the digitization, the fact that we have everything instantly, I think that's shifting the way in which individuals perceive themselves and perceive the world. And I don't think it's necessarily a positive shift. I think I'm grateful that I learned how to write longhand, and a lot of people, can't do that anymore. So it's not just a nostalgia. The idea of hand-eye coordination and the ability through that hand-eye coordination to express an idea in this wavy line that you put on a piece of paper, that's an athletic prowess that many people are losing.
One of the things that you talk about in the book, Peter, is this whole idea of attachment and how the human brain is constantly seeking to form bonds with other humans through things like empathy, and this is what makes us stronger. And everything you were just speaking about in terms of, kind of going to the library and doing research in that way, it implies that there's something physical about learning, and then there's something physical about kind of going out and contacting and being around other people that perhaps is something that is lessened when we're online all the time, when we're digitized all the time. And I'm just wondering whether you think actually this is true or not, whether in order to have greater attachment, these greater connections with people, that more physicality and more movement, more kind of in-person connection is needed.
Yes, I think that is very important. The other driving force, other than individualism in the human psyche, is attachment to other creatures, because we have a very long period of development, and we're totally dependent initially on the kindness of others, our parents and strangers and so on and so forth. And that organic interaction, I write in the book, you probably read that chapter on love, which starts with my daughter runs a sheep farm, actually, and she has a young daughter herself, and it talks about the similarity between the bonding almost immediately, this happens to be in Vermont, which is a cold area of America in the winter, and the bonding of the lamb to the ewe is absolutely essential to survival, and that's all driven by smell and by touch and by warmth and so on and so forth. Well, actually, the bonding of a human mother or father to their child is driven by exactly the same biological variables. And so if we don't provide for that, then the natural attachment does not develop. And it's only through a stable attachment that young children come to trust those around them. And it's trust that enables individuals to then review the circumstances that they experience and decide for themselves what is constructive and what is not constructive. So you have a continuum, basically, between attachment, trust, self-regulation, and then you move to empathy, where once you understand that continuum as a young child, and it happens quite quickly, that young children can be empathic by 2 to 2.5 to 3 years old. If they see somebody crying, they will come over and comfort them. And empathic behavior then is the understanding, the capacity to put yourself in somebody else's shoes. Smith used the analogy in those days. Imagine your brother on the rack. He was writing in the mid-1700s. You can't understand what he's going through unless you place yourself on the rack and realize the pain and the tragedy and the fear, etc., etc. That empathic understanding then is what builds society. That's the glue of human culture. And although we think that with Facebook, we can have 3,000 friends or whatever, that is not the same as developing an empathic understanding of an individual. In fact, the internet, as we all know, is a place for extraordinary bullying and general difficulties for many young kids. They feel, my God, I wrote that text to my friend 5 minutes ago. Why haven't they called back? Do they not like me anymore? So the way in which human attachment works has not changed. That's my point. But our technology has changed such that we are frustrating that developmental path that I was trying to describe a little earlier. So I think you're right that the way in which you have to have, I think you've called it digital mindfulness, you have to have some sort of understanding of all this in order to keep that developmental path without it. You have to be able to develop that path without encroachment of the technology, which then distorts it, and you end up with weird people.
Yes. I'm wondering then, what are the things that I guess, what are the main things that you would recommend that people can do right now to tune their brains well?
Well, I think, first of all, it's to better understand who we are. That's why the first part of this last book is called Who Do You Think You Are? Because we have this imperial sense as human beings that we really are invincible and we can do what the hell we please. It's clear to anybody who sits down and thinks these days that that's not true. We can see limitations in all sorts of ways, not only in the environment, but also in terms of our social organization. We could go off on that madness of crowds. But so I think that, first of all, you have to realize there are limitations to who we are, that the way our brain works is largely it's driven by these very fundamental and primitive survival instincts, that we have an extraordinary capacity for memory, and that what I call intuition in the book, develops through experience, essentially an autopilot. So most of what we do every day is not consciously driven. It's pre-consciously driven. And so all your social behaviors, almost all of them, and even many other behaviors are habits. They're habits just like, when you cycle to work or drive to work, you take you go, you don't even think about it. You get there somehow, but you haven't consciously reflected upon that. Well, that's because your brain takes that over and you don't need to reflect on it consciously. If you think about that in a social organization, then what you teach kids in their youth, go back to the iPad or whatever, some other electronic device that engages them. By the time they're 2 years old, you've really formed an incredible baseline of habit that will be with them for the rest of their lives, yes? And so you have to think about how are we tuning our brain right from the very beginning. And then as the individual becomes more conscious, and this is what the task of education is all about, we need to build in these reflective exercises so that indeed one does become well-tuned about oneself. One learns about we each have amazing capacities, but they vary among individuals, and they vary among individual groups as to what we prefer, et cetera, et cetera. And that's the beauty of a democratic society. You can choose more or less what it is you want to do, et cetera, if it's working properly. So that whole process of tuning becomes very important. And you have to recognize that, at least I believe one has to recognize that can be distorted by, for example, the markets we create. And that is very rarely talked about. I mean, the fact that you can't buy a house in London is driven in part by the market, yes? Because everybody else wants to live in London. And that's fine, except that means that you're on a continued escalating climb where a lot of people are going to be left behind. So you have to wonder, is that good or bad? I'm not terribly political, but it has huge implications in terms about how kids grow up, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that once you get to that point, then you can ask yourself, what is the best marketplace that we should? Human beings love markets, but a sort of devil take the hindmost, everybody out for themselves, no common taxation thread that enables a common infrastructure to be built, which is one of the big problems. One of Trump's big things in America at the moment is our infrastructure is crumbling. It's true. Nobody has invested in it for 20 or 30 years. So you have to ask then, what sort of markets serve the way in which the brain best develops? That's the first part of the book. The second part of the book is very simple, and it goes through a series of discussions about trust, as we were just talking about it, and then the other wonderful things about human beings. What about our imagination? How does our imagination drive our social order? You could make a very good case for the fact that our capacity to imagine ourselves in the future is what drives much of our technology. Our ability to imagine ourselves in the past is what drives most of our religion. You can begin to understand human culture through the lens of neuroscience, and that's really what the book is about. So then you ask, what is a well-tuned brain? Well, it's a balance between the excitement of the new, the excitement of the future, with an understanding of what we've learned in the past, to essentially throw history into the dustbin and say, well, that's not important. That happened in such and such a time, and we're not interested in that anymore. I think that's a big mistake, because people like Hume and Smith and others in the 18th century, on which our current political culture is based, by the way, in the Western world, as I said before, the concepts of the Enlightenment philosophers. If you don't understand that, then you don't know how we got here in the first place. And if you don't know how you got here, you're not really clear about where you're going, yes? So I think it's a philosophical as well as a practical amalgam that I'm trying to build with these various books.
Fantastic. What would you say then are the most important human traits, and how can we cultivate those?
Well, I think we've touched on them to some degree. One is individualism, obviously, individual initiative, and the opportunity to engage one's curiosity is absolutely essential, and that's what a free society is designed to try to do. Now, but the other part of it is this balance between the freedom of individual expression and the way in which society must run, which is by definition collaborative, because there has to be a common good. Otherwise, we'd have chaos. Yes, so you've got to find that balance between the two things. So I think at one level it's attachment and the awareness, empathic awareness of others. That, as Smith said again, it's only through the he talks about the shoemaker and the candle maker and the tailor and all those people. It's only through these others who contribute through their own self-interest that I have the good life that I have. Otherwise, you'd be making all your own shoes, all your own suits, all your own furniture. It's these. So that's how society works. But that has to have a set of rules. You have to have the way in which we all agree upon it. You can't exploit people, etc., etc. That's what we constantly are trying to balance against individualism. So it's individualism and attachment and empathy that have to be balanced. And societies are constantly swinging back between those two things. And so in the recent election that we talked about in Britain and in the US before we went on the air, I think that you see that oscillation very clearly, because you've got a group of people who feel they're being deprived of their individual liberties and rights in Brexit or in the votes for Trump here, and they are neglecting the understanding that a collective, I'm generalizing obviously, a collective infrastructure is necessary in order to make individual liberties possible. So if it may well be that there was a necessary course correction, that we've regulated ourselves too much, etc., etc. I don't take any position on that, but you can see the pendulum is swinging back and forth. That's a good sign, but we have to find some way, ideally, in the middle where we can both thrive as individuals and express the creativity that is natural to every human being, at the same time as we can live in harmony and empathic understanding of others. So, that's long been the philosophical drive of Western societies, and it gets pretty hairy at times. But I think that tyranny doesn't work. Absolute socialism doesn't work, which is another form of tyranny. And so, we have to be vigilant. Now, why do you need vigilant people? Well, because of what I've just been saying. But how do you get vigilant people? You get them through a process of education and understanding and reflection, self-reflection, which is the metaphor I use for the well-tuned brain.
Amazing. Unfortunately, we've come to the end of the interview. Where can people find out more about you and your work?
Well, I have a website. I'm a little. I don't keep it up to date as much as probably I should, but peterwhybrow.com, www.peterwhybrow.com. You'll find some stuff there, and then the books are pretty much available. I think they're there in Britain as well as here in the US, and most of they've been translated into various. Actually, interestingly, into Russian, the last one, and China. I don't know why they got interested, but they did. And so they're in various. You can get them in various places, and there's you go to Amazon, you'll find them there, and so on and so forth.
Fantastic. Well, Peter Whybrow, thank you so much for spending time with us today. I really appreciate you sharing your time and your wisdom with us.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. I appreciate your efforts in this regard. I think you have a very good program and a good project there. I think some of your podcasts are fascinating. I've been listening to them, so thank you for that.